And I'm going to start. Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Cindy Grove. I am the director of the Rockford Public Library. And I am so glad to see so many people join us on what is a very interesting weather-wise Sunday afternoon after a storm. So thank you for being here. Today is a continuation of our European art series. Today is Parisian cafes and Impressionist painting. And let's see, our presenter, Jane Oneail, is back with us again today. Jane was leading tours at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston when she first began to appreciate the special magic that happens when people look at art together and share their genuine reactions and questions. Talking about art requires bravery. You inherently vulnerable when you share your perspective. There is joy in seeing things in a new way and in simply shifting gears to appreciate the beauty and poetry of everyday life. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She was born and raised in New Hampshire and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held a role as senior educator. Jane founded the Currier's Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program for the Museum of the Frank Lloyd Wright-designated Zimmerman House. She has taught art history at the college level for more than a decade and most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. So I want to thank Jane for being here today. I also want to thank all of our participating libraries who have joined to make this event possible. I know we have Burlington with us today, who is helping me out with the Zoom, and I greatly appreciate that. I also want to thank our own Rockport Public Library friends for helping to sponsor this event. So thank you for being here and for being part of this event. And I will turn the screen over to Jane. Thank you, Jane.
All right, thanks, Cindy, and thank you, Marnie, and thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about the Impressionists and this sort of secret favorite subject of theirs. My whole approach to putting this program together today is sort of thinking about Impressionist paintings in general, and I think we oftentimes associate them with like gorgeous landscape paintings, these bucolic scenes that transport us to beautiful places where we all want to go. Well, there's a little bit of a seedy underbelly to Impressionism, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. We will be getting back to this very interesting image that's on the screen, but I wanted to start off with a program overview to give you a sense of how we'll spend this next hour together. So we're going to start off with pretty generic, basic introduction to Impressionism. We're going to talk about the importance of realism because this was a huge shift in painting at the time. And this idea that you would even be painting scenes of everyday modern life in general was revolutionary. So we'll talk about how they get to this point. Then I'm going to introduce to you the idea of the flâneur, the modern sort of Parisian man who was just walking around town, taking in the sights and how he figures into a lot of these paintings. Then we'll zero in on cafes and cafe concerts, and then wrap up with sort of what this looked like in subsequent decades because it was such a popular subject. Now, the image over here that I have on the screen right now is not by a famous Impressionist artist, but it is of a cafe where they frequently went to talk, to share ideas. Artists like Cézanne, Monet, Degas, Renoir, they were all there. And sometimes the conversations could get pretty heated. At this particular cafe, in fact, Monet confronted an art critic who was a little bit too pointed in his criticism, and they actually had a duel. Manet shot someone there, but they ended up staying friends. So a lot can happen at one of these cafes. This is the Café Gerbois, incidentally, and it was painted in 1886 by an artist named Raffaelli. So it's called Café Gerbois. All right, so looks like I've come out of my view right here. Just a moment. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's get started with our introduction to Impressionism. And I'm sure for most of you, this is just a reminder about some of the big ideas, the underpinnings around this revolutionary style. We are, of course, looking at an example of Impressionist painting from Claude Monet. This was painted in 1873. And I want you to sort of hold in your mind, it's like the 1870s. That's like the golden decade for Impressionist painting. And so like I said, when we started off, this idea that when we think of Impressionist painting, we think of like these light, airy scenes here, where the poppies in particular are rendered with like this loose, fluid brushwork without a real attention to detail. There's a sketchiness to these works, and that is, of course, what made them so revolutionary for the time. They looked like unfinished paintings. They were considered unfinished paintings. But of course, we've become so accustomed to the idea that a painting can be something that doesn't have to look photographic. It is something other than a photograph. And that's what these artists were really kind of pushing against, this idea that art had sort of a new purpose, a new function in our lives because of how the technology related to photography had kind of come along. So we'll see with Impressionism, these kind of bright colors here. It's a sunny day. We see this loose brushwork. Look at just how wildly he applied this red paint here to suggest these poppies. It's loose. These are visible brushstrokes. Sometimes I refer to them as broken brushstrokes. And an image like this is so iconic because it shows us these kind of almost like dreamscapes that we'd like to be a part of. So when we think of Impressionist paintings, they tend to be these horizontally oriented landscape paintings, just like the ones that we see here. But as this program will show us today, it is so much more than that. Continuing on with the foundations of Impressionism, one of the reasons we associate it so closely with landscape painting is this idea that artists were working outside. And this image here of painted by Renoir is a depiction of Monet painting in his garden from 1873. We're so lucky because this painting is actually in America at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford. And it's such a great teaching image because it shows us exactly how an Impressionist painting was made. We see Monet working at this sort of small rickety easel outside, responding to changes of light and shadow, and of course, using the world around him as inspiration for his own artwork. So some of the basics that go along with this is that artists were by necessity using smaller canvases. They had to move their own equipment around to get it in and out of doors. So they're also using tubes of paint, which was a fairly new invention for the time. Prior to that, artists were mixing their paints in glass tubes and bottles, and even sometimes in animal bladders. So you can imagine once the tubes of paint came out, it must have felt so easy. So what you get from all of this is a sense of informality, a sense of immediacy when you're looking at these images. And of course, they're not a record of the world. They're not photography, but it's, as we'll see, these images are greatly influenced by photography. When it comes to Monet, we think of an artist who's sort of obsessed with light, obsessed with color, and that's what gives us those, our rich associations. And his beautiful series of things like haystacks. These are two examples of haystack paintings, both from 1891. On the left is in a private collection. This one over here on the right is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And it's a reminder that the way Monet was essentially picturing the world was like squinting through his eyes and sort of seeing seeing where there was light, where there was shadow, and trying to capture those shapes on his canvases. He said, try to forget what objects you see before you, a tree, a house, a field, whatever. Merely think, here is a little square of blue, there's an oblong of pink, here's a streak of yellow, and paint it just as it looks to you, the exact color and shape, until it gives you your own impression of the scene before you. And so, of course, working this way and in this style produced some of our favorite works on the planet, right? I mean, Monet was so successful in what he did. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the fact that when he semi-retired to Giverny, France, he created his own water lily garden out behind his house, complete with this Japanese bridge that's featured in the collection of the Princeton University Art Museum. Over here on the right is one of the many examples of water lily paintings that he created, inspired by this artificial garden in his backyard. We continue to see these loose, visible brushstrokes, but as he continues to explore the subject of water lilies, you can see how this subject and the way he approaches it becomes a great precursor. It sort of prefigures abstraction in the 20th century. There's no horizon line here. It's essentially a flat, abstract painting with just the suggestion of light reflecting off of the surface of the water here. And then these little the little water lily pads along the way. All right, so to get us more oriented to everyday life, I wanted to show you a different kind of Monet painting here. We have Monet over here on the left and his friend Renoir over here on the right. When these artists really first got going, working in this style, these are paintings that were done concurrently in 1869, so right before that golden decade of French Impressionism. We have these two major artists working together, working outdoors, and they're inspired by a particular scene on the water here. Both of these paintings are called La Renoir, which essentially refers to like a cheese wheel. And that's what we see in both of these paintings. There's a floating restaurant on the right in both compositions, this little island in the center. And I think in order to get to the restaurant, you have to walk to the little island and then you can walk over to the restaurant. With Monet, you can always tell which one is Monet's in this comparison. He's really much more interested in the water, in the reflections on the water, in rendering that forest in the distance. When it comes to Renoir, as we'll see, he's always much more interested in the people, the fashion, the social interactions. So this is where we're going to essentially bid farewell to Monet, because he gives us a good primer on French Impressionism, and then we'll sort of see how different artists use it differently. But for now, what we're going to do is turn our attention to the subject of realism. And there's a different artist who is crucial to our understanding of realism and its very important influence when it comes to French Impressionism. So this artist is named Gustave Courbet. Here he is in a self-portrait with a pipe. He is an artist who introduced a completely new way of thinking what art can do in the modern world. When it comes to Gustave Courbet, the year 1850 is really helpful to keep in mind. So we have Impressionism coming up almost 20 years later. Gustave Courbet was an important forerunner, working right at mid-century, and he was doing something revolutionary at a time when art was being created for the aristocracy, for the nobility, for kings and queens. And so subjects were appropriately elevated and lofty. They were subjects related to history and religion. Gustave Courbet decides to paint poor people, and he paints poor people with all of the sort of attention and care that artists of previous generations would have given to, the subjects of kings and queens and previously thought of important subjects. So on this slide, we have on the left the Stonebreakers from 1849, and on the right, the Wheat Sifters from 1854. So these are pictures that that depict very poor people doing very difficult work. I mean, can you imagine spending your day breaking stones? Notice how these men have torn and ripped clothing. Notice how we don't even see their faces. We are asked to focus on their bodies and the difficult work that the figure groups are doing in both of these compositions. Prior to Courbet, I must emphasize, nobody was painting scenes of contemporary life, let alone scenes of working class people. It just wasn't the kind of thing that people wanted to put on their walls. So Courbet really kind of burst onto the art scene with this massive composition. If you've ever been to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, you might remember seeing it, although there's a lot of other works in this room that sort of draw attention away from it. But this is his famous image called Burial at Ornans. And it's sort of a showstopper because it's 22 feet long and it's 10 feet high. And this is a great example of Gustave Courbet and his attachment to the subject, to realism in his artwork. So first of all, we have sort of a banal subject here, just a burial. And in this case, it was the burial of the artist's great uncle in a small town outside of Paris. And so he's rendered with as much care and detail as he possibly could the attendance at this particular ceremony. So over here on the left, we have members of the clergy, we have the pallbearers coming in, we have a couple of male attendees for this funeral right here around the center, and then we have all these female attendees, mostly towards the right. You notice that most of them are sort of overwhelmed by emotion and they've turned their heads away from the casket that's being brought in. Now, all of these figures are roughly life size, if not larger. This is a 10-foot high canvas. And essentially where it's hung, how it's hung, what we, the viewers, are really looking at is the hole in the ground and the skull alongside that hole. So this is like another picture that is a great reminder of our own mortality, but how at the same time, this is an everyday occurrence. Now, for Gustave Courbet to paint this on such an unbelievable scale, when, you know, a lot of these figures were considered pretty ugly for the time too, because they were rooted in realism. These are everyday people that we're looking at here. So people were, well, let's just say a lot of feathers were pretty ruffled by this presentation of such a you know, unimportant subject matter. I will say that people sort of took away from this kind of an underlying political message too. If you're going to show all of these people essentially at the same level, you're kind of suggesting a little bit of an egalitarian message too. So kind of equalizing these different classes, because the art world had always been so stratified, was another way to really get noticed in the art world at this time. So let's transition to an artist who's more closely associated with French Impressionism, and that's the artist Edward Monet. Now, he's sort of our proto-impressionist. He's mostly painting in the 1860s. We're going to see him again towards the end of today's program, but he's an artist that never really said, I'm an impressionist, but he broke ground. He's sort of like our missing link between Gustave Courbet and Claude Monet. Monet is introducing a whole new way of picturing the world, essentially. So he takes that realism that Gustave Courbet has introduced, taking the everyday as an appropriate subject for art, and he loosens up his brushwork, and he's doing a few other things to make really novel kinds of pictures. So this is an image called Music in the Tuileries. This is from 1862. It's not a funeral, of course. It's a scene of leisure, and that's the subject that's really sort of carrying us through today's program too. So it looks unfinished in many ways. There's just kind of like blurry passages throughout here. You'll notice that this umbrella in the foreground sort of looks like it's missing some detail here, but it was presented as though it was a finished work. And what we're seeing here are the daily lives of the upper middle class, of the bourgeoisie, basically, living in Paris at the time. And so it's a fashionable crowd, it's a fairly affluent crowd, and they're gathering in this park to hear one of the regular concerts that was provided there. So this was really Manet's first painting of contemporary life. And it's a crowded scene, isn't it? It's sort of jostling in some ways. We just see like the sea of top hats, really. But I want to remind you and emphasize that this was not considered really an appropriate subject matter for the art world at this time. Instead, I mean, you should be focusing on mythological subjects or, like I said, religion or history. So he was doing something that was pretty unusual for the time. And this was something that was kind of aligned with literature as well, because it was his friend Charles Baudelaire that agreed with him and also wrote this essay called The Painter of Modern Life, where they felt like it was just as heroic to take on the subject of modern urban life in their whether in their chosen art form, I should say, as any other subject here. So we've got a couple of really interesting elements in this picture, figures that seem to be looking out directly at us, all this wrought iron work in the chairs here too. But I will say that for this picture, Manet depicted a lot of his friends. And so oftentimes art historians get really deep into the who's who of what's going on. I want to share with you what I think is a much more sort of compelling image to go deep in, is one other Manet image, which is also an image of leisure that's carrying through. That's our sort of our big idea for today. And it's still kind of proto-realist, proto-impressionist, but it's an attempt for Manet to give us a scene of modern life, pleasure in the modern world. And this is a picture called Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or Luncheon on the Grass, painted the following year. It's from 1863. So it's still before this golden age of Impressionism. And you might, and this is probably one of the most radical images of all time. It definitely shook the Parisian art world, because even though we're seeing what seems like a very straightforward depiction of these figures sitting in the grass in the woods, there was a lot of really shocking elements to this. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about how it's painted, because like I said, he's sort of this transitional figure, Manet, in terms of linking up realism with Impressionism. And part of the way he does that is there are these kind of sketchy, almost unfinished passages in his paintings. But one of the things that he was also doing, in addition to these beautiful kind of realist still lifes like we see here in the foreground, is that he would use a very sort of harsh transition from bright colors, bright white light, to dark, to like the dark jackets of the men seated here. So you have this female nude sitting here with this bright white flesh. There's really nothing sensual or beautiful or alluring about this flesh. It almost looks corpse-like. In fact, that was really the reaction against it. And so, this juxtaposition and that sort of harsh contrast was one of the major reasons that this painting was harshly criticized. Coupled with that is the expression on this nude woman's face. Of course, she looks out at us very matter-of-factly, as though her nudity here should be taken for granted. And of course, that is the biggest issue when it comes to Déjeuner sur l'herbe. We have two fully clothed men lounging on the grass, seemingly engaged in conversation, and right alongside them, a woman who looks like she has just taken off her clothes. Now, Manet was trying to find really sort of a lens through which to tell the story of modern life. And it appears as though he was looking back at paintings and prints from the Renaissance and was inspired by works like this one over here on the left, painted by Giorgione and Titian, where we see, two clothed male figures surrounded by female nudes. These nudes are probably nymphs. They're probably not women who were actually there. But Manet took a note essentially from Giorgione and Titian to try and make an updated scene of this kind of pastoral symphony that we see happening over here. And people did not like it. They didn't like the fact that she was naked. They didn't like the fact that she seemingly just took off her clothes and that she's so matter-of-fact about it. I will say that Manet was really looking hard for Renaissance sort of precedents for his paintings. In fact, this is a print of a Raphael drawing, and you can notice over here that Monet actually borrowed this composition, or was inspired by this composition for his work over here in the Déjeuner sur l'herbe. So that's that same nude figure looking out at us, very matter of fact here. Now, despite these high-minded art historical references from Monet, this was a swing and a miss. Like I said, this shocked the art world. People did not like the style of painting or the subject that he was painting at all. But like I said, Manet's going to get another shot. We're going to circle back to him a little bit later. But coupled with this idea of realism, infusing realism and scenes of everyday life into work, and this Impressionist brushstroke, now we're going to sort of move into the city. And I wanted to talk with you about the flaneur and what the flaneur is. Now, we are primarily moving into the 1870s now, that golden decade, and we will be sort of in and out of cafes as they're such an important part of Parisian life and Parisian nightlife. Now, we keep up with this idea of the male gaze, because all of these artists are male artists that we're going to be looking at, creating work primarily for male viewers too. So these are images that are for men and by men. And so what we'll see in a lot of them is the opportunity to sort of assume the position and assume the viewpoint, the perspective, the gaze of the men that are being depicted here. This is an image from 1876 called Man at the Window by an artist named Gustave Caillebotte. I really love his paintings. Now, this is a great depiction of a French flaneur. And a flaneur is a French term meaning a man who essentially strolls or loafs around. This was a term introduced by Charles Baudelaire to describe a detached observer of modern life. Now, this was flaneurs were typically fairly affluent men. They were men who could kind of wander about the city. They weren't men who were hard at work, and they really had no other purpose than to be an observer of industrialized contemporary life. And what we'll see is that most flaneurs are sort of dandies, like the one that we see depicted here. It's somebody who prides himself on dressing well. He's very interested in fashion. And to a certain degree, he kind of keeps a distance from what he is observing. So we see this male figure from behind. He's leaning over this balcony and presumably gazing down this wide boulevard here, taking in the sights and sounds of Paris, sort of inviting us to do the exact same thing. Now, here's actually a photograph of a flaneur. and so we can think of these flaneurs, you know, here they were just standing on street corners, as a principal performer really in the theater of daily life in Paris in the second half of the century. In fact, there's a description of a flaneur that dates all the way back to 1858. I think you'll appreciate this. It says, flaneur was the kind of man, the flaneur, that kind of man is a mobile and passionate daguerreotype who retains the faintest traces of things, and in whom is reproduced with their changing reflections the flow of events, the city's movement, the multiple physiognomy of the public mind, the beliefs, the antipathies, and the admirations of the crowd. So this concept of flaneur was one that was really important. And incidentally, Edward Manet depicted himself in his own paintings as a sort of flaneur, even, you know, a decade or so earlier. This is Manet in the Gardens of the Tuileries that we just saw, and he does include his own self-portrait here. Now, Caillebotte gives us a couple of different views of flaneurs, and I just wanted to show you them quickly. This is one from 1875, and it's Young Man at the Window. Now, a flaneur, I think, by very definition, since we're talking about male figures, we're sort of setting up this dynamic of the male who gazes and the woman who's being gazed upon. So we see another male figure staring down an open boulevard. We see him from behind. We can sort of project ourselves into his body. But I think what's really important with this image here is that when you zoom in, you can sort of see that he's looking out at this solitary female figure who's crossing the street here. So there is this idea that in modern public life, you are always going to be observed, especially if you are a woman. Caillebotte gives us all sorts of wonderful views and perspectives here. We have a scene where we're looking down off of a balcony, another one over here on the right where we're looking over the edge of a balcony with this wonderful perspective, bringing our eye back. But this idea of being out and about and taking in the sights and sounds is one that he goes back to quite a bit. This is, I think, a favorite French Impressionist painting for so many. It's called Paris Street, Rainy Day from 1877. It's at the Art Institute of Chicago. And in this case, we have a dandy, a man who could be a flaneur, but he does have a female companion here, and they're sharing an umbrella. And on this beautiful street that's with the wet cobblestones here and all of the reflections of light in those little pools of water, we have them sort of distracted by the sight of something that's happening outside of the frame here. And it makes us wonder, what is the spectacle that they're taking in? A similar image also by Caillebotte over here on the right gives us a more ambiguous relationship between the male and the female here. In this case, the gentleman is walking a few steps ahead of this well-dressed woman. Are they together? Are they separate? What is he looking at in this particular case? But we do definitely have another flaneur here who's peeking over the edge of this particular boat. This is, or a boat, the particular bridge. This is called the Pont de l'Europe from 1876. So we're going to transition now. I do want to show you just one more Monet painting, Claude Monet. We don't often associate him with portraits, but he did create this image of his wife Camille sitting in a park on a bench from 1873. And I've always found this to be such a fascinating and sort of haunting image, because we do have a flaneur type that has entered the frame. So we see Camille, who we know at this time was mourning the death of her father, and she's sitting on this bench in sort of darker clothes. There's light in the background, but she's sort of in shade, and she's looking out at us with these kind of sad eyes. And then this man sort of leans into her space, really. It almost seems as though she's leaning in to get away from him or to give a little distance there. He has probably brought her flowers. Maybe he's one of their neighbors here. But in this case, it almost seems like this flaneur has taken the next step and has sort of entered into the story. He's no longer a detached observer. He's somebody that is trying to make a connection here. And it's interesting to me that Monet has captured a scene where maybe there's just a little bit of discomfort associated with that. The next artist I wanted to share with you along a similar vein is the artist Renoir, another famed Impressionist artist. We saw him before working right alongside Monet. Now, Renoir has always been interested in the dynamics between the sexes. And so we're going to see a lot of images of these conversations, of these flirtations. This is called Leaving the Conservatory from 1877. This is at the Barnes Foundation. And perhaps this is an image of simple flirtation, or perhaps this is another slightly unwelcome flaneur. I love to read the body language in this image. So they've just come from the concert. She's got her program sort of rolled up in her hands, and she's leaning back against a wall or a pillar here. And notice how it's really two couples here, and it's interesting how their friends are sort of supporting each other as this conversation takes place. But certainly the gentleman over here on the right looks like a classic flaneur, engaging this young woman who doesn't necessarily seem to be totally accepting of his advances. Her friend, who is smiling, has encircled her arms around her friends. And this gentleman has a companion as well, who seems to be supporting him on the back. But for the most part, Renoir liked to give us images of flaneurs, images of these detached observers of modern life, men who almost occupy the margins of his pictures. Here we have umbrellas from the 1880s, and then the cafe over here from 1874. And each of these images are about, public life or daily life in the modern world in public spaces. Here we're outdoors in a crowded area. There's this chaos of umbrellas. There's a very well-dressed woman with two beautifully well-dressed children. And one of them is looking directly out at us. But it seems as though the protagonist of this work is the kind of working class woman here. She's beautiful. She is also looking out at us, sort of matching that gaze here. She doesn't have an umbrella. She has the opposite of that, really, a basket. And there is a man just behind her, a flaneur, who seems to be taking this all in. We see something similar unfolding in this cafe scene over here on the right, where there are two women at a seat here, and there's the dandy, there's the flaneur, who almost seems bemused, taking in what's happening with these women and the man who is approaching them on the other side of the table. Perhaps he was even this man's companion. It seems there's an empty chair across from him. So these are scenes of bemusement and benign scenes for the most part. As the sort of the toughest scene that Renoir produces in terms of these gender dynamics and the role of the modern French man as the flaneur is this image called La Loge from 1874. And here we can see a man who is actively engaged in observing the modern world here. And as they're sitting in their opera box, which itself sort of functions like its own little stage. You know what it's like when you get all dressed up to go to the theater, and it's a sort of see and be seen kind of event. And that's what Renoir has produced here for us. He gives us a woman who is as lovely as could be, and she is adorned with flowers and pearls and gold and all of that, but she does not have the same sort of agency as this gentleman companion that we see over here, who is very clearly not looking at what's happening on stage, but really looking at other people here. Renoir's best known, and I think his most beloved scenes, are scenes that are also about leisure, scenes that are really teeing us up for cafes as well. This is the Moulin de la Galette from 1876. It's at the Musée d'Orsay. So it's sort of an outdoor ball where you could have drinks, you could dance. And I think that this is such a benign scene with a real sort of balance in terms of the way that the opposite genders are engaged with each other, particularly here in the foreground. You don't get the sense that anybody feels threatened here. There's a nice sort of gender dynamic with this sort of stack of these two women here talking over the back of this park bench to a group of seated gentlemen. We don't even see the primary gentleman's face here, but we do see his sun-dappled back. This is painted with sort of all the glory of that French Impressionist style. Now, the more time you spend with this, the more of these sort of fascinating interactions you can see. There's a gentleman in a straw hat over here who's leaning up against a tree. Notice that he seems to be speaking to a young woman who is gazing off in the distance. Maybe she's not even aware of him. Just underneath his arm, there's a woman even further away who seems slightly alarmed at what he's doing. And then way back here, we have a gentleman wearing a top hat, perhaps a flaneur himself, who seems to be also kind of leaning onto this park bench into this woman's space, this woman back here in the blue dress. So fascinating dynamics, a real kind of push and pull between who is kind of seeking behavior and who is getting that attention. So let's turn our attention now to one less famous Renoir painting. And this is a great transition to looking at cafes and cafe concerts. This is called The Luncheon of the Boating Party from 1881. So as far as Impressionism goes, this is like the height, the sort of almost the last gasp of Impressionism. This painting has these wonderful passages of really kind of loose brushwork, these reeds just beyond this balustrade here, where we can see the river in the distance. And this was a really challenging picture for Renoir to paint, because he actually broke his arm, his dominant arm, about 4 months into painting it. So he felt like he was a little bit creatively blocked anyway. So he tried painting with his non-dominant arm, and he felt like it sort of gave him a breakthrough. So art historians have sort of tracked down and identified who each of these figures are. But I think part of the reason we just love this scene is we love this idea of being out on this terrace, access to, this beautiful still life where there's wine and treats and snacks, where people are engaging with each other in maybe a flirtatious way, but in ways that suggest a real comfort level with each other. Now, when I mentioned push and pull before, I think you get a lot of that here as well. Notice how some figures are sort of leaning backwards, particularly these men with the sleeveless shirts. They're both sort of leaning away as other men are leaning forward, and certainly both of these women in the background are sort of leaning forward. You can almost liken it to the flaps of this awning, sort of pushing and pulling in different directions. So there's a real sort of careful balance in terms of this composition and this interplay between the genders here as well. Now, that sort of gender dynamic is another really fascinating piece as we go into the world of Parisian cafes and cafe concerts. And the artist that really takes us into this world is the famous artist Edgar Degas. He's probably best known for his ballerinas, so I give us a ballerina image here. And what we see with an image like this, a little bit different from like his famous images of ballerinas rehearsing and stretching, is we can actually see them on stage, rendered with these kind of beautiful gauzy tutus here, but we see them through the forest, or just above the forest, of all of these realistically painted male heads in the foreground. And these are all musicians in the orchestra pit. So this is a composition. This is a format essentially that Degas uses when he goes out at night and he starts creating images of the world of Paris nightlife. Basically, this is sort of a safe, sanitized view of culture in Paris. But Degas liked to go out, and he liked to sort of get into it in terms of Paris shows and interacting with women too. So these are two images of cafe concerts. And cafe concerts, as you can see, have a little bit more interaction and a lot more informality in the performances. It's women on stage once again, but we see men in the orchestra pit in the foreground as well. Now, cafe concerts were sort of raunchy shows. There was a lot of suggestive content and a lot of off-color jokes. So these women, some of them were probably prostitutes, and certainly people went there to be entertained and to laugh. And maybe there were some musical components to this as well, but it was it was mostly comedy. And to add to that kind of comedy, sexualized comedy in this case, Degas includes the little joke of the scrollwork of this double bass rising up above the heads of the orchestra over here as a very prominent phallic symbol in both of these images here. So he gives us all sorts of fascinating scenes of performers on stage, of people in the audience. This was a particular performer named Mademoiselle Bacat, and she was known for like this frenzied comic dance that she did with her arms raised up like this and her fingers splayed. And this style of dance was referred to as epileptique. So you can imagine it was something that was a real showstopper. And so Degas has added in some members of the audience here in the foreground. He really loves to use these pillars as like interesting ways to kind of divide up his canvases. We'll see see that again here in one of my favorite Degas images. This is another cafe concert, and this one's called The Song of the Dog. It's in a private collection. It was painted in 1877. We've got that prominent pillar right here. We've got the suggestion that this is sort of outdoors. We've got the audience that's rendered very loosely over here on the left. And then this rather plump performer with this almost garish red hair color. Back in the 1870s, most of the women that dyed their hair this color were either performers or courtesans. So we're going to see a little bit more of that. Now, the very wealthy American collector who ended up buying this picture said, "There is nothing elegant about this woman's pose. Her hands suggest the movement of a dog from that popular song of the period, and the gesture is done as only Degas could do it, with a flash of drawing. The lines of the mouth as she bawls forth the vulgar song, her exultant exaggeration, showing she is conscious of her power over her audience, all this and much more." So you can see that this is something that was created for pleasure, for amusement, reflecting the fact that that's what these shows were about as well. Now, Degas would sometimes render these performers in almost over the top, really unflattering way. This is an image that's in the collection of the Harvard Art Museums, and it's called Singer with a Glove. In this case, we don't know who the performer was. This one was done in 1878. Now, I want to just highlight for you one important element here is that we've got this sort of stripe of red and green here in what is presumably the edge of the stage. But notice how it really clashes with the performer's pale pink dress here. So we already have this, this element of being unsettled before we even get into the content of the picture. The colors here just don't resonate. They don't really connect and click for us. Now she's holding her hand high as though she's holding this operatic note, but he does not portray her as like a beautiful ingenue. Instead, her head is tilted back, half of her face is in shadow, and she's seen from sort of an awkward angle. This is an unflattering picture in so many ways. And we can see from early sketches that he's really playing with just how awkward and ungainly he can make her. This is an image that's really focused on what I think was intended to be comedic exaggerations here. Now, Degas would oftentimes realize that sometimes the best show wasn't even what was happening on stage. So in this image, this was our title slide that we started off with here. This is called The Spectators from 1877. This is at the Art Institute of Chicago. We have this performer in a bright yellow dress in the back, and all of these people who are interacting with each other, leaning over little balustrades here to connect with one another, having these side conversations. In so many ways, this is like a dark version of Renoir, because none of these figures are rendered in such a way to make them beautiful or particularly alluring. And this is all created in the space of like a dark sort of concert hall. So not in the bright light of day. It's a very different take on leisure and modern leisure from Degas. Now, he has given us a few more images here. This is called Women on a Cafe Terrace. This is from 1877. Once again, notice how he's not attempting to render these women as classically beautiful. He's using these pillars to fragment and sort of chop up his canvas once again. And art historians generally agree that these women are understood to be prostitutes for the time. Notice too that they've dyed their hair that sort of garish red here too. So he's using unusual compositions. He's using this kind of immediacy to tell us exactly what the world of cafe concerts and cafes at nighttime in Paris really looks like. Now, a lot of these figures who were out and about in Paris were drinking heavily. And that's what we see in this image here called The Absinthe, or The Absinthe Drinkers from 1873. I'm sure most of you have heard of absinthe before. It is a very strong liqueur that also has like wormwood in it, and it was said to have hallucinogenic properties. So if you were drinking absinthe, you were probably sort of knocked silly, knocked sideways. So we see this woman here in a kind of drunken stupor. We don't even know if she's actually there with this man who's alongside her. There seems to be no connection between them. And she seems as though she is all alone in this world, even though she does seem to have a companion here. It's a stark and sort of jarring scene. It's certainly not a jovial scene of Parisian nightlife, but it gives us some insight, a slice of life that artists like Monet were not painting at the time. And Degas rendered these solitary figures in cafe settings again and again. This one is called Woman in a Cafe from 1877. Notice the elaborate costume here, the highly decorated hat and the red hair. She's a plump woman as well, and she's not classically beautiful. So I think she is either a courtesan, or Degas intended her to be somewhat of a comic character. She sits at a cafe table by herself with these playing cards in front of her. And so this is the type of woman that, that really you could only see if you were a man, if you were a flaneur, if you were somebody out and about town. So just as a quick contrast, somebody like Mary Cassatt, who was a good friend and fellow artist to Edgar Degas, who was a woman working at the time, could never paint an image like this. Instead, she was sort of relegated to the tea parties, as we see over here. Now, very quickly, some of Degas' images of women in these cafes, I think, can be really emotionally poignant. Excuse me, this is one that I've always really loved. It's from 1877. It's just at the cafe. It seems as though this woman is troubled. Maybe she's speaking to what is sort of testing her in this moment. And we see a fellow, a companion, another woman who seems concerned and maybe is listening. Look at how loosely this is painted. This is pretty wild. This is like beyond Impressionism in so many ways. And once again, this is so different than the kind of life, the kind of upper class society that female artists were portraying, because they couldn't go out in Paris in the same way as somebody like Edgar Degas. Now, in our last few moments, I wanted to circle back to Edward Manet, because he certainly created some wonderful scenes in the late 1870s into the early 1880s of people and women out at these cafes. Sometimes they're concerts, sometimes it's just a cafe. This one is called The Plum. This is at the National Gallery of Art. And once again, we see this solitary woman here. She's smoking a cigarette. She's got her little plum here. And it tells us a lot about her, that she seems to be there by herself, that she's lost in thought. We have a sense of where she stands in Parisian society, and yet she's rendered so beautifully and so thoughtful. Now, most women of the bourgeois class wouldn't be seen in a cafe by themselves. They would be the kinds of women who were mothers that Mary Cassatt would be painting. So this is a really unusual scene of an independent woman. Now, Manet painted a lot of crowded cafes as well. And here we can see a top-hatted gentleman in the foreground. This is called At the Concert from 1879. It's at the Walters Art Museum. And he has a female companion alongside him. But as we spend a little bit more time looking at this, we can't really tell if they are together. She looks like another absinthe drinker. She looks like she's in a drunken stupor. They both have these large mugs of beer in front of them. And then we have a woman who I always imagined was a waitress behind them, but she's also drinking beer. Notice how everybody is looking in a different direction. There's this sense that even in these compressed spaces of modern life, that there is a disconnect between these individuals. There is a performer on stage in the distant, in the far background of this particular image, but it gives us some insight into to how lively, how boisterous, and how maybe even alienating some of these spaces were. Another fascinating cafe scene from Edward Manet towards the end of the 1870s is this one here. We feel like we're sitting alongside the bar. Maybe we're even the bartender in this particular image. We've got another top-hatted individual. Did he just come in and sit down with this woman? It appears as though they still have their overcoats on. They do have their drinks in front of them. She seems like she's having a great time. And then your eye wanders over to this woman that we see in profile, who has this really haunted expression on her face. So once again, this scene of good times on the one hand, and then the scene of alienation. Another great cafe image from Edward Manet that shows us this real kind of mix of emotions and classes here. We have people in the cafe, they're drinking beer. We've got a woman who's serving the beer. We've got a performance up on stage as well as musicians. But once again, the fact that everybody seems to be looking in different directions gives us this sense of disconnection in this particular arena. So we'll end our look at Impressionist cafes with Manet's last great masterwork. And this is the bar at the Folies Bergère from 1882. This is at the Currier Museum in London. And with this work, we see a woman who's presented behind this bar with this lovely still life in front of her. And for all intents and purposes, she looks like just another addition to it. She is presented with this, incredible statuesque figure, the flowers here in her bodice, but with this look of detachment and sadness here as she is tending this bar. She is in a theater setting in this case, where we can see behind her really what she's looking at. There's a big mirror behind her, so she's looking out at this audience. There's even a trapeze act that's happening up here in the top corner. And so even though there's so much to gaze upon, she seems so sort of reticent to kind of emotionally engage. And then we notice at the far right here, a top-hatted gentleman, essentially a dandy, a flaneur type, who has approached her to make an order. We see in her reflection a woman who seems much more eager to engage with him. But the central presentation of this woman here is just so striking and gives us, once again, such insight into the sense of what it was like to be a part of modern society in France at the second half of the 19th century. Just for kind of fun here, I can show you an earlier sketch that Manet did of the bar at the Folies Bergère, where he's sort of working through this idea of how do I show this woman and the mirror, her reflection, and then the man coming to make this order here. I can imagine this was a pretty complicated composition to come up with. All right, so we're going to just sort of wrap up by thinking about what happens next. Impressionism clearly embraced images of leisure and the city and the cafe, as much as it did embrace images of beautiful pastoral settings. So as we head into the 1880s, what happens to Impressionism? What happens to cafes? Well, some of the artists that we looked at, like Degas, just leave it alone. Maybe he kind of grew up and out of going to cafes, but he begins to focus on the female nude for the most part. And actually, that's what happens with Renoir too. He stops painting these scenes of people dancing at little balls like this, and instead he's focusing on sort of a more classical subject for the history of art. So what we begin to see in the 1880s is this whole new generation of artists like Toulouse-Lautrec and artists even like Vincent van Gogh, who are taking up the cafe subject because it's now an acceptable part of, or an acceptable subject for the world of art, but they're presenting it through an entirely new lens. This is an image by Toulouse-Lautrec called At the Moulin Rouge from 1892. This is at the Art Institute of Chicago. And so here we can see sort of a small grouping of people who are out and sort of conversing at a cafe, but I can hardly ever get past this woman with the green face who's staring out at us from the edge of this picture. And certainly a face that's illuminated in that way is one that's been inspired by the work of Degas, like we see over here. Toulouse-Lautrec also created a lot of posters for the nightclubs in Paris. And you'll notice that he's using another familiar formula from Degas. This is a famous dancer called Jean Avril, another famous dancer over here called La Galou, but with that instrument, with the double bass and that scroll work sort of rising up out of the orchestra pit, that is taking a note from what Degas was producing during the 1870s. So by the time we get to Vincent van Gogh, a cafe scene is something very different. It's not this kind of jovial place where people are taking in performances or maybe having a little bit too much to drink. In this case, he is giving us, well, he's focusing on really Degas' idea of a place of urban alienation. And so you can almost imagine Vincent van Gogh updating the absinthe from the previous decade and adding his own sense of sort of wild color to this scene to emphasize what a jarring and sort of uncomfortable place it was to be. So we can see this sort of short-lived period where we have kind of the height of French Impressionism with that loose brushstroke, with this attention to the momentary effects of light and shade, and where we see these artists really sort of delving into the spectacle of modern life, what it looks like when you go out to a cafe, what it looks like when you go out to a ball. And it's such a sweet little time period in the history of art before you move on to things like Vincent van Gogh in post-impressionism. So thank you for journeying with me through the 1870s to appreciate this fascinating short period of French impressionism, where these artists showed us just how much fun they were having in Parisian cafes. So I will end there for now, and I'll start going through the chats to see what sorts of questions and comments people might have for me here. Let's see. Marnie, thanks for sharing the artists that were in today's show. JD asked, was Zola a painter, a word artist rather? As far as I know, he was just an author, but he was very influential at this time. Deborah Rose says, it is my understanding when photography was invented, the artist was in competition with the camera. The artist had to think of a way of painting that the camera could not do. Thank you for stating that so beautifully, Deborah. I was sort of trying to touch on that. And I could imagine that it was sort of a crisis for the art world to a certain degree in terms of what is our function. If the camera can document, how can we portray the world or respond to the world in a way that is not mechanical, in a way that is more expressive? And so I think Impressionism is in direct response to it, and also in dialogue with it. There's a lot of, interesting cropping, interesting perspectives that we saw throughout today's program that were certainly inspired by photography. So it's such an important development in the 19th century. I appreciate you bringing it up again. And Carol says the tube of paint was invented in Manchester, New Hampshire. I have heard that as well, Carol. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's amazing to think that something that came from New Hampshire could have such an influence over across the pond. Carmen says, was the burial at Ornan a commission or a studio piece or something else? Great question. I don't know off the top of my head. Well, I'm fairly certain that nobody commissioned it because it was his own. I think it was his great uncle's burial. So I think it was him trying to make a splash, a studio piece, I would say. Marnie, thanks for sharing info about the next month's program on Renee Magritte. You're going to be singing that Paul Simon song all day that day. And a preview of that program. Oh, I'd love to share that with you. Okay, so Renee Magritte was a surrealist artist who was working around the same time as Salvador Dali, but he had his own sort of very intentional way of making a surrealist image. And he never wanted to decode what those images were about, but we're going to see that he uses like this sort of familiar language from picture to picture, these symbols that become very meaningful. And then we'll see this incredible influence his work has had on not just the art world, but on music, on so many other things. So so that will be a lot of fun. And I'm trying to think, oh, the most famous Magritte painting that you know, and maybe don't know that it's by him, is the man in the bowler hat with the apple in front of his face. So that will be next month. And I'm looking through the rest of this. People are saying such nice things, and I really appreciate you sharing your afternoon with me and saying such nice things. Danny asked if the previous sessions were recorded, and I believe they probably were, but I'll refer to my librarian partners for that one. Oh, and Catherine says, going back to your previous program and the unicorn tapestry and the A and the E backwards. Oh, often meant God, but the backwards E is a Latin shorthand meaning something. Oh, wow. Okay. Catherine, I am actually going to copy and paste this into an email. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know it's sort of off topic for today, but I really appreciate you holding it in your head and sharing that with me today. So thank you. I'm going to go back to that. Let's see here. Oh, wow. Okay. Everybody, you're very, very kind. Thank you so much for the kind words. I think I got to everything. And I hope this was a really fun way for everybody to spend their Sunday afternoon. It felt like a little trip to Paris for me. So thank you, Marnie, and thank you, Cindy, so much for having me. And I think we're done for now, but I look forward to seeing everybody next month for a little surrealism. That will be a real shift for us. Take care, everybody. Have a good one.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I put onto for those of you who are still here, I put into the chat the link for the Rockport YouTube channel, which does have not only these programs, but some of our other programs as well recorded. This one will be uploaded there as well. So if you missed something, you can go back and return. If you want to revisit something, please feel free to go back and return. And thank you so much, Jane. This was phenomenal. And I really look forward to our next presentation, which again is April 16th at, double checking my time, 3 p.m. And I hope to see everyone there. And so thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
All right. Bye now. Have a wonderful Sunday.
Bye.